Hi, my name's Sally Russell. I'm from Griffith University in Brisbane, Australia. I'm a senior lecturer in the Asia Pacific Centre for Sustainable Enterprise, and today I'm going to be talking about some research that comes out of a stream of research I've been doing. Some of it's also funded by the National Climate Change Adaptation Research Facility. A bit of forewarning, the papers that are being drawn from this work haven't yet been published. They've been collegially reviewed but not yet peer reviewed. The research is about emotions and climate change, so looking at how people's emotional reactions to climate change subsequently affect their behaviour. And some of the key findings that are coming out of this research are that different emotions lead to different types of behaviours, and in fact, certain emotions, such as sadness or hopelessness, can lead to the opposite effect and actually deter people from acting in response to climate change. Another key finding is that we really need a sense of self-efficacy, so a sense that what we do can create change, and in doing so we can have a positive impact on climate change. And in a nutshell, that's what I'm going to be talking about today. It's a pleasure to speak on this topic and to see other people also talking about emotion. I think this is the first time I've shared the stage with someone who has spoken about climate change and emotion, and after Andy's talk last night where he was also talking about how emotional climate change can be, I think the first part of my talk is already done. Normally I have to justify why climate change is an emotional issue, but not today. So the project that I'm going to be talking about, essentially two different studies. One of them is partly funded by the National Climate Change Adaptation Research Facility, and also it has undergone a PAL review or a collegial review, but not yet been undertaken a full peer review, so I'll put that caveat on the research. Just to give you a bit of a background, all of my research is based around this issue of individuals, because when we look at the research in sustainability broadly and also in climate change and organisations, a lot of it looks at the macro level, and we heard a lot of that macro perspective just before lunch. So research traditionally focuses on these macro issues: strategy, regulation, reporting, measurement, as well as market and competitive forces. I'm going to shift the conversation a little bit and move it much more towards the individual level. So the research that I do suggests that individuals really play an important role when we're talking about addressing climate change issues, particularly in creating and sustaining change both inside and outside organisations. So individuals play a leadership role, but also this role in sustaining change. So when we look at this literature, and I draw on a number of different areas, so environmental psychology has done a lot of work in the area of pro-environmental behaviour and looking at how individuals respond to the environment and also how they affect the environment. But most of that research is done in a household setting. So I kind of bring that in and also look at organisational psychology literature as well as organisational behaviour literature. So trying to bring these three things together in order to inform the research. So in looking at those three areas, we see a real dominance of attitude theories, and Steve was talking about cognition earlier this morning and how worldviews and political ideologies and the cognition around climate change. But what's although that's been really, the cognitive perspective has been really valuable, we also need to consider the emotional aspects. As Chris was talking about, this issue is inherently emotional. So referring to Damasio's work in Descartes' era, I think, therefore I am, is actually, although partly true, yes, we also need to consider the emotional or the affective element and the relationship between cognition and emotion. And we can't really fully understand behaviour unless we also understand this affective and emotional component. So in looking at how people respond to climate change and what they do in response to climate change, we really need to consider both aspects. So when I talk about emotion, what I'm talking about is a response to an event. So emotion is different to mood. Mood is a general feeling which doesn't have a significant object that we can specify has caused that mood. Whereas emotion has this object specificity, and in my research I look at how climate change causes an emotion, so a feeling. It's a response to an event, and it also is an information processing mechanism. So when we have an emotional reaction to something, it tells us that it's important and perhaps that we need to act on it. So it provides this impetus for action. And you can also think about emotion in terms of valence and arousal, so these two dimensions, where valence is the directionality, so whether we have a positive or a negative reaction, and arousal is kind of the strength or the intensity of that emotional experience. So in looking at emotions and climate change and emotions and environmental issues more broadly, the literature suggests that, and indeed Chris's research suggests that climate change is an emotional issue. So it is something that we can say is an event that causes an emotional reaction. The literature in environmental psychology suggests that we need to get people emotionally engaged. So if we're talking about climate change, we're talking about environmental issues, we need to tug at those heartstrings and get people emotionally engaged, and then they're going to act. Past research has suggested that it's not really important whether that's positive or negative, but it's just getting those heartstrings tugged, and that's going to lead to action. And looking at both the dichotomy of positive and negative, very few researchers have looked at this arousal component, which is the strength of the emotion experience. And this is really what I wanted to do, is look at discrete emotions. If we start to unpack it a bit, so we see fear in relation to climate change, or hope, frustration, anger, all these sorts of emotions are discrete. And the research and literature around the emotions theory suggests that each of those discrete emotions have a different behavioural tendency. So if I feel angry about something, it means that I can blame someone about it. There's someone I can point to and say they're responsible for this. And also I have a sense that I can act upon that issue and resolve it. Whereas if I feel depressed or hopeless about an issue, yes, I might see that it's a very negative situation. I'm not sure who's responsible, and I have a feeling that I can't act on it. So each of these discrete emotions, they are both negative emotions. We can't lump them all together, and that's really what my research is trying to do, is unpack what this discrete emotion experience has, and then the effect that that has on behaviour. So I'll run you through two groups of studies. So the first one, I aimed to kind of manipulate people's emotions, and what I did was I showed them videos, messing with their minds or maybe their hearts. So I filmed these videos. They were false reports about climate change, about an IPCC report, and I hired some actors and they presented the news reports using certain emotions. And the aim was to create a sense of emotional contagion, where I would show you the video and then you would experience that emotion in relation to climate change. I'd then give you some surveys to complete, and I also had a behavioural response. Not a perfect behavioural item, but I really wanted to test what people actually did. So in the, when we look at research, we tend to, particularly in psychology, just get people to fill out surveys and take that as an indication of what they would do in practice. When in fact we see that what people say they're going to do and what they actually do, there's a big difference between the two. So I had these two behavioural indicators. The first one, when I was doing it in person, I had people complete a piece of paper and then I asked them to dispose of it when they left the room. And they had an opportunity to recycle or not recycle that piece of paper. Again, not a perfect indicator, but it is an indicator of pro-environmental behaviour. I also ran the experiment online with office-based employees, and I asked them if they would like more information on how they could reduce the energy and waste in their offices, and whether or not they chose that option was I took as an indicator of their environmental behaviour. So I tested 5 different emotions, and as I said before, this is what's called the circumplex of emotion, where it's the 2 dimensions of arousal and valence. So positive to negative on the horizontal, and then intensity on the vertical. So the first emotion was sadness, which is a low arousal negative emotion. And you can, I don't know if you can see it very well, but she's looking pretty sad in that picture. This is the newsreader. Fear, again, the actors in the videos were trained to display the emotions both in their voice tone and their facial expressions. And I also changed the imagery that was used in the background. So the images of smokestacks, and there was also garbage being rolled and waste in the negative videos, had been shown to arouse negative emotions. I also tested anger. Although anger and fear are both high arousal negative emotions, the literature suggests that they do have different responses. So a flight response in relation to fear, or a fight response in relation to anger. The high arousal positive emotion was both hope and joy. So it was difficult to untangle those, but very positive voice tone and facial expressions in that video. And you can see, I'm not sure if you can see it, but the image in the background is solar panels with a white, blue, sunny background and white clouds in the sky. And then the low arousal positive emotion was contentment or confidence. So I showed people, they saw one of the videos, and then I tested their responses. What I found in this study was that sadness actually had the strongest effect. What I expected was that it wouldn't be any different to the control condition. So people who didn't get any emotion, I just gave them a written condition or they saw a neutral video, and I expected sadness to be about the same. But what I found was sadness had a very strong negative effect. So next to no one recycled or collected information in that category, where a few people in the control condition did. So what this suggests is that negative emotion can actually be worse than not giving people any information at all. So a strong negative effect. And that was the most consistent finding across all 3 studies. The other discrete emotions that I tested did have some effect, but they weren't as consistent across the 3 as the sadness finding. And what's interesting in the difference between these two, I guess if we group them, the 2 groups of emotion, is in all of anger, fear, hope, joy, contentment, and confidence, there's an efficacy component. So in all of those emotions, going back to the theory, there's this element where to feel that emotion, you have to have a sense that what you're doing can actually have an impact. So there's a sense of efficacy in those emotions. In putting the organisational context in, I actually found emotion was less important. And I've got a range of other studies that suggest the organisational context can actually, it does give a clear signal to employees about what they do. So, but that's another area that I won't go into too much at the moment. The second study that I'll go through very briefly is a work in progress as part of this NCARF research. And I'll acknowledge my other research co-authors, Kelly Fielding from UQ and Alice Evans from Griffith. So we wanted to kind of develop this research a bit further and look at attributions. So when you think about climate change, do you have someone to blame? Is it relevant to your goals? So linking back to what Chris was saying is, do you see climate change as an opportunity or a threat? And that can lead to either positive or negative emotions. And there's a range of other attributions that lead to different emotions, but these were the two that we thought were most relevant in this situation. So we ran another experiment online with 320 working adults, and they were recruited from a participant pool. In this research, one of our project partners is a hospital in Queensland, a large hospital. So we put the study into a hospital context and conducted a scenario study where we gave people information about this fictional hospital, Superior Healthcare, and we told them information about their role, their mission, and their values. And what we did in that information was manipulated whether or not the organisation had a responsibility for climate change, and also whether their values were congruent or not with addressing climate change issues. So the organisation's mission was either congruent or not, and then the organisation was either a contributor to greenhouse gas emissions or it wasn't. So it was a 2-by-2 design. The manipulations were successful, but what we found was that it was only the congruence attribution that had an effect. So those people who were in the scenario where they thought their organisation had values that weren't going to be congruent, they saw climate change as a threat, they felt a lot more disappointment than anyone else in the study. There was no link, interestingly, from that emotion to behaviour, and I'll show you in a graphical representation in a second, which might make a bit more sense. In terms of the emotions themselves, people who felt enthusiastic, but as well as worried, and hopeful in relation to climate change, so they're the 3 emotions they felt most strongly, they then were more likely to engage in pro-environmental behaviours. So doing things around the office, whether it be reducing waste, energy, water, those sorts of things, at an individual level. And we also measured whether people were supportive of their organisational policies. So the pro-environmental behaviour is essentially what I can do. The policies are what the organisation is doing. So those who felt enthusiasm and worry, similarly to the other ones, but also less happiness and less embarrassment, were more likely to support those organisational policies. So this is it in a graphical representation. So you can see the goal incongruence leads to disappointment, but those other emotions then lead to pro-environmental behaviour intentions and support for green workplaces. So we don't see a link between the attributions and the particular behaviours, which was unexpected. But we're doing some more follow-up research, so hopefully watch this space and I'll get back to you. So essentially, incongruence leads to disappointment. And this may have implications for the organisation itself. Although we didn't measure other variables other than pro-environmental behaviour and support for policies, it may have an impact on job satisfaction, turnover intention, and other organisational variables, productivity perhaps even. So that's an area that we're starting to look at as well. We also found in this study that both positive and negative emotions are important, and it may be a combination of emotions that get people to act. So having that enthusiasm as well as that worry and having those together may cause people to act in terms of climate change. The first study I did, the aim was just to look at very specific individual emotions. In this study, we're starting to see that maybe it's blended emotions that can have the most impact. And if you think about hope, it's actually a blended emotion in that you're fearful about something that's happening, but you also have a sense that there is something that can be done and a resolution will occur in the future. Enthusiasm and worry led to policy support, and perhaps these people who have both of these emotional responses to climate change might be those people who are best acting in champion roles, so engaging in the organisation's initiatives. So overall, my research really underscores this point that emotion does arise from climate change as an issue. And it's also clearly a driver of behaviour. So discrete emotions have varying effects. So in designing interventions and even communicating climate change, we really need to pay attention to those emotional responses to make sure we're not actually giving people so much information that they feel depressed and disheartened and actually do the reverse. Well, I might as well speed this thing up and get it over with. We really need to make sure that there's a sense of efficacy and give people essentially hope that what they're doing can have an impact. So caution needs to be taken in the design of behaviour change interventions and also the implications for climate change communication. And I'll leave you with one of my favourite quotes about individual action from Eckhart Tolle. He says that a change in the collective does not happen until a change happens in the individual. This is why we're here. We're seeing the collective insanity and seeing how it works. And that's the first step to liberation. Thank you.